When it comes to Dune, many of us probably think of Denis Villeneuve's sweeping dunes and slow-mo spice trips. If you're a bit older, you might think of David Lynch's iteration of Dune, where we got Paul Atreides with his pug. But there's another version of Dune that isn't talked about as much, and that one is Frank Herbert's Dune, a miniseries which came out in the year 2000. This three-part Sci-Fi Channel miniseries was weirdly ambitious, occasionally beautiful, and definitely an attempt to bring Herbert's sci-fi epic to life. It had William Hurt sleepwalking through half, if not most of his lines, but it also had heart, it had ambition, and before all of the modern iterations came to life, this was considered to be the most faithful adaptation of Dune ever made, even if for a brief moment. So you gotta wonder, what happened to the Dune miniseries, and why did it fade into the spice mist of obscurity? We're going to explain all of that to you today, but before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. So, adapting Dune isn't an easy job. I think we can all agree on that. You see, from the very beginning, Dune was a problem child. It's like trying to condense all the information from an encyclopedia into a pamphlet. That kind of approach has risks, and it could ruin the book entirely. This book spans generations. It explores the psychological journey of its protagonist and delves into a universe with factions like the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and the Fremen. Each guild has its own customs, dialects, and even motives. There's no easy entry point to Dune. There's no Luke Skywalker to latch onto. Dune isn't interested in the stereotypical good versus evil dichotomy. Instead, it wanted to look into prophecy, fate, and how messiahs are made from oppression, systemic, brutal, and long-term oppression. The novel is a complex source material, and that's why it was hard to sell to Hollywood studios. The dense internal monologues with deep ecological themes and layers of politics don't translate into a visual medium. If you try to do it, it might just come off heavy-handed, or worse, incomprehensible. Even the famed voiceover technique that David Lynch used in his 1984 adaptation of Dune couldn't save the film from confusion and pacing issues. It was all over the place. The fans of the book felt disappointed as the movie didn't do the source material justice, and the newcomers, oh boy, they were left completely confused. Before the miniseries that came out in 2000, there were two major Dune adaptations. We have Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune from the 70s and David Lynch's Dune from 1984. Jodorowsky's Dune never made it past the pre-production stage, but it was highly ambitious. He wanted Salvador Dali to play the Emperor in a 10 to 14 hour epic with Orson Welles as Baron Harkonnen. Pink Floyd was supposed to be the main artist for the music. The project's concept art and storyboard, which are available online if you're curious, effectively influenced the future of sci-fi, but the movie was never made. It was too big to be made at the time, and this vision remained one of the more tempting what-ifs in cinema history. On the other hand, we have David Lynch's Dune. This was the first Dune movie that hit theaters, but it had heavy studio interference and it was cut down to just over 2 hours, even though the movie was supposed to be 3 hours long. Lynch disowned the film publicly because of these constraints. The movie is certainly visually striking, but that doesn't mask the confusing narrative. It struggled to explain the complex plot of the book, and with the rushed pacing and omitted subplots, this movie was bound to fail. It's a cult classic, yes, but it failed to capture the depth of the source material or the imagination of the audience. And the take-home message from this disaster was that you cannot do Dune justice in just 2 hours. This was the hill that the miniseries was willing to die on. John Harrison, a writer and director who worked many times with the horror maestro George A. Romero, entered the project. Harrison isn't the first person you think of when it comes to a space opera, but given how many times he's done work with character-driven horror, he was the best candidate to choose. He had something that no one else had on hand. He had time, and he was willing to give Dune the time as well. Instead of trying to squeeze this movie into just 2 hours, Harrison decided to create a 265-minute miniseries. This allowed the story room to breathe, the characters some space to evolve, and the audience the much-needed time to acclimate to the sprawling lore of Arrakis. Choosing to show this on television instead of movie screens might have seemed like a budget compromise for some, but somehow this was the perfect format for Dune, and the Sci-Fi Channel was ready to give the Dune miniseries its all. So, how do you adapt Dune, which has one of the densest, most complex sci-fi plots ever written, with only $20 million as a budget? Well, the answer is you get very very, very smart. You see, back in the 1990s, TV was treated like the little sibling of cinema. Prestige television was just starting to find its footing. The Sopranos launched in 1999 and blew all expectations out the door, but science fiction? That was still in the realm of the budget limitations and the cult fandoms. The Sci-Fi Channel had a niche audience and was mostly known for reruns and oddball original movies like Mosquito, so imagine everyone's surprise when they decided they wanted to tackle Frank Herbert's Dune as a miniseries. The first brilliant move they made had to be the decision to go long form. Unlike Lynch's film, which crammed everything into 2 hours and looked like a fever dream, this miniseries broke it all down into 3 90-minute episodes. That's a full hour and a half of storytelling, allowing the narrative some room to grow. Instead of speedrunning through Paul Atreides' transformation into Muad'Dib, the show allowed everything to simmer. Harrison knew that Dune wasn't just an action epic, it was a political, philosophical, and ecological slow burn. With the miniseries format, he got ample time to play around with the story in the way the source material did with the characters. Scenes of religious manipulation, palace intrigue, and subtle character development finally had the space to unfold. And sure, the pacing could feel methodical at times, but it echoed Herbert's prose, which we love. Now, one thing about Dune is that it's intergalactic in nature. We have so many planets, each with their own distinct customs, costumes, dialects, and traditions. This isn't going to happen with just $20 million. I mean, you have CGI sandworms that are bigger than you or I could ever imagine. For comparison, Game of Thrones had around $10 million per episode, while Mission Impossible 2, which came out that year, had a budget of around $120 million. So you had to stretch that cash. And how do you do that? 3 words. Location, location, and you guessed it, location. The entire production was filmed in the Czech Republic, in the Barrandov Studios in Prague. This decision saved millions in cost. The Eastern European studio provided all the top-notch crews, sound stages, and scenic versatility for a fraction of the price they would have had if the show had been shot in Los Angeles or London. On top of that, by shooting on sound stages, the production got a kind of control over the result that's not achievable if you do an outdoor sci-fi shoot. The sets were meticulously designed and lit to match the story's needs, and they didn't need to rely on weather-dependent desert locations, which can be super expensive. Instead of chasing realism, they decided to lean into the theatricality of stage play. This was not the Arrakis of Denis Villeneuve's Dune, it was a distilled and symbolic world. And before you think that this was some kind of accident or just a financial decision, let me tell you, Harrison knew what he was doing. He chose this as an artistic decision. He knew he couldn't match blockbuster visuals, so he didn't even try. Instead, the team went for the expressionistic approach, which looked almost operatic. This choice also gave the miniseries its most recognizable signature, abstract minimalism. Frank Herbert's Dune denounced the photorealistic grit and embraced the bold colors, the operatic costume design, and the stark geometry. The sets were sparse in number, but each one was suggestive and unique. Caladan was covered in tranquil blues and flowing silks. It inspired nobility and tradition at first glance. Gedi Prime, the home of the Harkonnens, was greasy and industrial, shot with shadows and sickly green overtones. And Arrakis itself was beige, angular, and brutalist. It was a barren world that was indifferent to human life. By modern standards, these sets look small. Many of them were simply redressed rooms that were reused across multiple scenes, but they were built with care. The interiors felt like they had been lived in. Some even felt ceremonial. The Atreides Palace halls, which clearly had limited square footage, used draping and lighting to make them look longer and add visual depth. The set dressings were clever, and with the tight framing, the crew managed to pull off the illusion of scale. And with the maximalist outfits, it's hard not to fall for the illusions. Theodore Pistic, the Academy Award-winning costume designer of Amadeus, designed the costumes so that the wardrobe went full space opera. The characters were embellished. The Bene Gesserit wore elaborate headpieces, complete with flowing dark robes, and you could see at first glance that their presence signaled ancient power and religious austerity. The Spacing Guild navigators looked like rock pharaohs with the glam filter on, crossed with Byzantine priests. The House Carino outfits were so embroidered that they looked like mobile thrones. This kind of heightened costume gave the miniseries a surreal aesthetic that's aged really well. Sometimes it feels campy, yes, but it feels intentional. These were status symbols, religious garb, and imperial declarations all in one. The 2000 miniseries understood that Dune was about spectacle, control, faith, and power. And the wardrobe only made that clearer. But that doesn't mean the miniseries hit the mark everywhere. It dropped the ball severely when it came to special effects. Let's get one thing clear before we get started here. Nobody was expecting ILM-level CGI on cable TV back in 2000, but some of the effects are simply laughably bad. The personal shields were rendered with early digital films, and it made it look like the actors were covered in plastic wrap with shimmers. The spacefaring ships move like someone's dragging them across the screen with a mouse. Some background looks less like background and more like desktop wallpapers. But when you consider the context, all of this looks cutting edge. In 2000, all of this was serviceable at the very least. While the sandworms weren't hyper-realistic, they had scale, menace, and an iconic design. The show used these worms sparingly and mostly relied on sound design and occasional glimpses to build suspense. This Jaws approach of not showing the monster too often, forcing the audience to fill in the blanks, really worked in favor of the movie. And on the rare occasion we do see the worm bursting through the sand, they still command a presence, which is a lot more than we can say for some of the special effects used in higher budgeted movies from that era. The miniseries actually benefited a lot from its emphasis on the physical spaces and practical sets. Later production leaned heavily on the green screen, while this miniseries built so much on its environment. Each room was tangible, walkable, and textured, which added more to the realism of the show. These little things grounded the performances, which are often missing when the show or movie in question is highly dependent on CGI productions, like After Earth. The characters could interact with their environments in a way that didn't irk the viewers. The echo in the hallways is real, and they would act as if there was authentic architecture instead of pretending like there was architecture when actually there wasn't and it was getting CGI'd in later. The lighting too, for this reason, had weight. The shadows fell where they should, and the fabric caught the light in ways that fabric usually does, making the scenes feel present in a way that's really soothing to watch. It may not have been epic in scale, but this was intimate, and it worked. Another strong suit for this series was the sound design. The show's ambient noise was carefully layered. The desert winds of Arrakis were not there as a background filler. They slowly crept up into the scenes just like other characters did, reminding us that this planet was always looming. We had whispers of Bene Gesserit incantations, the chants of Spacing Guild, and the mechanical roll of shield generators. All of this together gave us a world that sounded ancient as well as alien. Graham Revell also did the score for this show. Instead of going sweeping themes or bombastic themes, Revell gave us a subtle and moody approach. The music often sat just below the surface, giving us an atmospheric feel. The score sounded more like a ritual than a composition, and it felt appropriate for a universe where everything was a ceremony or a prophecy. However, not everything worked for them. The action scenes of this miniseries were clunky and grossly underwhelming. The fight choreography was awkward and minimal. Large battles looked like stage brawls, and extras were simply waving weapons in slow motion. The siege of Arrakeen, which was supposed to be a climactic turning point, looked more like the high school production of Spartacus. The crowd scenes were underpopulated, and when the Fremen were supposed to be rallying in thousands, you could quite literally count the number of people waving the banners. But the show knew about all of this when they started their journey. It avoided overreaching, and instead it aimed for the ideas of Dune and focused more on the betrayals, the power plays, and the transformation of a boy into a myth. And this was a smarter bet than trying to fake Hollywood on cable's dime. This miniseries made its choices, but they were all in service of their ultimate goal, telling the story. They wanted to tell the story honestly, not perfectly or lavishly, and I would say, in the world of Dune, where survival demands compromise, this show was the most faithful adaptation of them all. But this isn't the only thing the show did right. By the time the last chapter of the miniseries aired, something had changed. Despite the modest budget and the sometimes debated performances, Dune sparked serious discussion and even garnered praise. This was no small feat for a network production back then. There were no streaming websites and no huge budget, but Frank Herbert's Dune managed to be a thoughtful adaptation. This success was complicated, as they got mixed reviews and were compared to Lynch's movie, along with the ever-looming question of what if they had more money. From the outset, the expectations for this series were cautious. The Sci-Fi Channel was popular for its low-budget B-grade content, so when they first announced that they would do a mini-series on Dune, people took that with a grain of salt. But when the first episode aired on the 3rd of December, things were different. This premiere managed to draw around 3 million viewers, which was a lot for those times. This was actually the most watched program in the network's history at one point. Fans were drawn to the faithfulness of the adaptation, something that Lynch didn't give them. But when you look at the reviews, it's a mixed bag. Some fans praised the narrative structure and how seriously they treated the source material, but others couldn't get over the low-budget aesthetic and the inconsistent visual effects. On Rotten Tomatoes, the reviews remain polarized. Some call it dull, slow, and aesthetically cheap, while others view it as a respectable and cerebral attempt at a dense science fiction show. Despite it all, what stood out the most was how this miniseries managed to get people talking about Dune. The Dune fans had another adaptation that they could weigh against Lynch's movie and Herbert's original text. Even the critics who didn't love it admitted that this miniseries made an earnest attempt to engage with Herbert's deeper political and philosophical themes. Among the Dune fans, this miniseries quickly became a cult classic. It didn't have the excess of Lynch's film, but it also didn't drown in voiceover exposition or derail itself with weirdness, except in those Baron Harkonnen scenes where he's floating around. That raised a few eyebrows, but overall, fans really enjoyed the show and showed noticeable respect to the creators for managing this level of accuracy despite the budget constraints. Some fans argue that Alec Newman's Paul Atreides is closer to Herbert's version than Kyle MacLachlan ever was. Some even preferred the miniseries because of its commitment to world building over the visual spectacle. However, the biggest point of consensus overall was how the miniseries was and remains the most textually accurate Dune adaptation to date. Many scenes, lines of dialogue, and even character arcs were lifted directly from the novel and entered into the miniseries, which a lot of other adaptations didn't do because of runtime or cinematic flair. The fidelity of this miniseries garnered it a special spot of legitimacy amongst fans. For many, this was the first time they got to see the political tension of the Landsraad and the religious undertones of the Fremen culture played out with appropriate depth, to say nothing of the Bene Gesserit's manipulations. Sure, the visual representation didn't always live up to the text's grandeur, but they tried, and that was good enough. For them, it was the closest something got to the Dune that fans had imagined for decades, and even if it wasn't quite the one, it was something. The miniseries also won 2 Emmy Awards, one for Outstanding Cinematography and another for Outstanding Special Visual Effects. This was an accolade for a cable program with such a budget. These awards, too, elevated the show in the science fiction community. The reception of the show was strong enough that the Sci-Fi Channel greenlit a sequel that came out in 2003. This was Children of Dune, which combined the 2 new novels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, together into one cohesive miniseries. This had a better budget, better visual effects, and a young, dashing James McAvoy. In hindsight, if you have to think about it, the legacy of the Dune miniseries lies in its persistence. It didn't set the world on fire, yes, but it did earn a loyal following and proved that Dune can be adapted, and that serialized television is the right medium for this kind of sprawling, intricate epic. It walked in 2000 so that 21 years later, Denis Villeneuve's Dune could run. And since we're talking about hindsight, people have been fascinated by what's lingering around this miniseries. What if this show received the budget it deserved? What if it came out a few years later? What if Sci-Fi Channel actually gave it a bigger budget like HBO did for Game of Thrones? And after all, why shouldn't we? The show had a solid script, it was faithful to the novel, and even if the cast wasn't star-studded, it was competent. But you can't escape the limitations of the $20 million productions, even if you try, when you're working with one of the most complex sci-fi worlds to ever exist. So fans have speculated, and they speculated hard. They think that with a higher budget, the visuals of the miniseries would be better. We could have had fully realized Arrakeen cities and ornithopters that looked legit. Maybe the sandworms would have looked like they belonged instead of looking like a polite appreciation. The budget constraints were visible in the climactic battle, and that could have been avoided. The casting would have also been a bit more impactful. William Hurt was definitely the best choice for Duke Leto, no questions about that, but other than him, there weren't any other household names. Imagine if Paul Atreides were played by Christian Bale or Jake Gyllenhaal, who at the time were rising stars. They would have added more buzz and given the show a bit more gravitas. Another constraint due to the budget was that the series ignored the more profound mysticism of Dune. The religious undertones were there, but they were downplayed. However, if the writers had had more daring, they could have added all the prescience and myth-making into the show, which would have made the universe feel more singular. Alec Newman's performance is good, but his transformation to Muad'Dib lacks the awe that it deserves. The show had the potential for an ongoing series that covered the entire Dune saga across many miniseries. But instead, they stopped at Children of Dune and left God Emperor of Dune untouched, which feels like a huge miss. Now, bear with me for a moment as I ask you all to imagine something. What would would the Dune miniseries look like in 2025? Imagine if Amazon Prime or HBO were backing it up. The budget would be huge, and given the audience is now hungry for high-budget content like that, the modern remake would give us everything Herbert's universe deserves and more. The serialized remake of Dune in this cultural climate would certainly overcome the flaws of the 2000 miniseries. After Game of Thrones, sprawling lore with multi-threaded politics and morally ambiguous characters are celebrated and expected. This series could lean into the Bene Gesserit conspiracy and the ecology of Arrakis in full detail, with the feudal interstellar politics and mental logic being expanded upon. And certainly, modern visual effects would enhance the portrayal of the desert world. The sandworms could be terrifying and majestic, making them look almost divine. The ornithopters would have the grace and the complexities that the books described. We could also get to see the spice-induced visions on the surreal aesthetics, like the dream sequences we saw in shows like Raised by Wolves or Legion. Plus, just think of the casting. Herbert's work had Middle Eastern influences from the get-go, and now, with the growing demand for inclusivity, we might just get that cast we really deserve. What if Mahershala Ali played Stilgar? What if Dev Patel is Paul? What if Cate Blanchett was the Reverend Mother? And instead of competing with Villeneuve's version, the streaming series could complement it. The series could dig deeper into the politics, the mysticism, and the characters, while Villeneuve focused more on cinematic spectacle and thematic elements. The show could explore the Butlerian Jihad and the origins of the Spacing Guild. Whether or not the studios are ready for something like this is a topic of discussion for another time, but one thing is clear. This miniseries has carved a place for itself in the ever-growing tapestry of Dune adaptations. Lynch's version is considered a classic with visual bravado, and Villeneuve's iteration is considered a polished and selective take, but this miniseries is placed smack dab in the center. It wasn't flashy, but it was faithful. For the purists, this miniseries was the only one that really tried to follow the original texts. It followed terminologies and political subplots, from inner monologues to literal inclusions of the Orange Catholic Bible. This miniseries wanted to show Dune as literature, and this is both its biggest strength and biggest weakness. For casual viewers, this feels dry or stagey, but for longtime fans, this was a treasure trove. The training of the Bene Gesserit wasn't just training, but it was integral, and the water politics of Arrakis were considered to be central to the plot. This miniseries kept the franchise alive from the late 80s to the early 2000s, when the franchise wasn't flourishing outside of books. So now, we live in a world where Dune is once again a cinematic powerhouse, but it all happened because this miniseries paved the way forward for it. It preserved Herbert's words as well as honoring them, and it built up quite the cult following while it did so. So now, you gotta wonder, what's the final verdict on this miniseries?
I am Otheum.
Marvelous verdict! Well, the answer is rather simple. This show, in many ways, is a classic case of ambition outpacing the resources. It sounds bad, I know, but trust me, that's not a bad thing. Ambition is what makes us grow. This ambition is what led to someone adapting Dune in the first place. While the miniseries isn't the most perfect production, it is an essential chapter in the history of Dune on screen. It was created when long-form television wasn't as loved or accepted. What Sci-Fi Channel attempted, well, it was ahead of its time. It tried to adapt the decent pieces of sci-fi literature for a cable audience, and this movie was bold and pioneering in its own way. The performances were uneven, but they showed the sincerest attempts at grappling with the complex characters that Herbert created. The sets, even though they were simple, showed how much they cared about visual identity, and this is loved by all. Even the harshest of critics had to admit the efforts put into the miniseries. The three-act narrative structure gave the show the time it needed to breathe, which no other adaptation has tried before. So today, this miniseries is remembered with affection by many. It's not essential for fans to view, but for hardcore ones, this is a hidden gem. This is a snapshot of the pre-streaming era when networks took bigger risks on sci-fi simply because they could. This miniseries has its own place in the vast history of Dune adaptations, and that's something worth celebrating. Unfortunately, that's all for this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.